Harold Davis and his wife Eleanor were not the kind of people anyone would expect to be the center of a police investigation. For most of their lives, they had been seen as an ordinary American couple, hardworking, humble, and deeply attached to one another. Harold had spent more than 4 decades working as a postal supervisor in Denver, Colorado, before retiring in 2010. His career was stable, reliable, and free of scandal. Eleanor, meanwhile, had dedicated much of her life to raising their 2 children, later picking up part-time work as a school librarian. They had celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in the spring of 2018, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and longtime friends. To those who knew them, Harold and Eleanor represented a generation that had weathered hardships with resilience and faith. After decades in the colder climate of Colorado, the couple decided that their final chapter should be spent in a warmer, quieter environment. In late October of 2021, they moved to Mesa, Arizona, settling into a gated retirement community called Desert Palm Senior Living Village, a place marketed as serene, safe, and designed for people in the twilight of their lives. The community offered shared facilities, recreational clubs, and medical support services. For many retirees, Desert Palm symbolized peace and comfort after a lifetime of work. For Harold and Eleanor, it was supposed to be a fresh start. But behind the calm appearance, their situation was not as ideal as it looked. Harold's health had begun to deteriorate sharply in the last 2 years. At 76, he suffered from advanced heart disease and was struggling with worsening symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Once a man who prided himself on independence, Harold now relied heavily on Eleanor for daily care. His tremors, difficulty walking, and frequent chest pains turned every day into a battle. The medications prescribed to him eased some symptoms but also brought on dizziness, nausea, and fatigue. Doctors had warned that his condition would only continue to decline. By the summer of 2022, Harold's quality of life had been reduced to restless nights, chronic discomfort, and moments of despair that Eleanor often tried to shield from others. Eleanor, who was 74, carried the burden quietly. To outsiders, she appeared composed and attentive, always present by Harold's side, always smiling politely when neighbors asked about his condition. But in private, she was overwhelmed. The cost of Harold's medical needs was steadily draining their savings. Retirement income, once thought sufficient, was no longer enough to cover all expenses. Their modest pension checks and Social Security benefits barely stretched to cover medications, medical equipment, and household bills. What Eleanor never told her children, or anyone else, was that she had accumulated significant credit card debt in recent years. She had relied on borrowing to keep up appearances, hoping Harold would improve, hoping things would balance out financially. Instead, the debts grew heavier and Harold's health declined further. Still, there was a sense of deep love between them. Harold had been Eleanor's partner for most of her life. She had met him when she was just 19, married him at 21, and stood by him through every challenge. To think of life without him was unbearable, yet to see him suffer was equally tormenting. Neighbors occasionally overheard Harold whispering about how he did not want to linger like this, how he wished for release from the constant pain. Those words, half despair and half prayer, left Eleanor haunted. She believed she understood what he meant, but the thought of acting on it carried moral and legal consequences she was not ready to face. By September 2022, the couple's circumstances had reached a fragile point. Harold's doctor had warned that he might not live through the next year if his heart condition worsened. Eleanor, worn down by exhaustion and financial stress, felt trapped. Unknown to most, Harold had recently signed an additional life insurance policy in early August, meant to provide Eleanor with more security after his death. It was a decision he had framed as an act of love, a way of protecting her. What Harold never knew was that Eleanor had already started viewing that policy as the only possible way out of their deepening troubles. The stage was set for a tragedy that no one in Desert Palms could have predicted. On the surface, Harold and Eleanor appeared like any other elderly couple navigating the challenges of aging. But beneath the surface lay a mix of desperation, love, fear, and hidden financial ruin. The quiet halls of their Arizona retirement community, with its manicured lawns and carefully planned tranquility, would soon become the backdrop of a criminal case that blurred the line between mercy and murder. The quiet rhythm of life at Desert Palm Senior Living Village had a way of masking hidden struggles. Days usually passed with the sound of golf carts humming along paved pathways, residents gathering for early morning coffee in the clubhouse, and gentle laughter spilling from weekly card games. From the outside, Harold and Eleanor Davis seemed to fit seamlessly into this world. They attended Sunday church services at the community chapel, waved at neighbors while watering their small patch of desert-friendly plants, and occasionally joined evening social events. To many, they embodied the peaceful retirement that Desert Palms promised its residents. Yet those who looked a little closer noticed subtle cracks in that picture. Harold's decline was visible to anyone who spent time with him. His once steady frame now moved with hesitation. His speech often slowed, sometimes interrupted by pauses as he tried to regain his breath. He rarely stayed long at gatherings, preferring to retreat home where Eleanor could manage his needs. Eleanor herself appeared thinner and more fatigued, though she dismissed any concern with polite reassurances. "Just tired," she would say, brushing away worry with a small smile. Few pressed further. In retirement communities, people were accustomed to the reality of aging. Illness was common and decline was expected. Still, Eleanor's watchful presence and Harold's growing frailty did not go unnoticed. Financial stress, however, remained a secret Eleanor carried alone. She had grown skilled at hiding the calls from creditors, at intercepting letters demanding overdue payments. On the outside, her life was ordered and stable. On the inside, the numbers never added up. Their move to Arizona had drained more than they expected. Medical bills arrived monthly, each one more daunting than the last. The debt she had quietly accumulated in Harold's final years of illness in Colorado now weighed heavier as she struggled to pay minimum balances. Pride kept her from confiding in her children. They believed their parents were enjoying retirement peacefully. To admit the truth would mean acknowledging not just financial mismanagement but also the desperation she increasingly felt. By late October 2022, Harold's condition took another sharp downturn. He was hospitalized for 3 nights at Banner Baywood Medical Center in Mesa after a sudden chest pain episode on October 21st. The doctor stabilized him, adjusted his medication, and sent him home with stern instructions. Harold's heart was weak, and the risk of a fatal attack was growing by the day. He needed strict rest, a careful diet, and close monitoring. Eleanor listened, nodded, and did her best to follow every instruction, but she also knew what the doctors carefully avoided saying out loud. Harold's time was limited. In those weeks, conversations between Harold and Eleanor became tinged with resignation. He spoke less about the future and more about the past, often recalling their early years together, their first home in Denver, the joy of raising children. At times, his words hinted at something deeper. "I don't want to keep being a burden," he whispered once, his voice trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. Eleanor reassured him, insisting that he was never a burden, yet inside she wondered how long she could keep this promise. The weight of caregiving, coupled with the hidden shadow of financial ruin, pressed on her shoulders every single day. Neighbors began noticing that Eleanor seemed more withdrawn. She stopped attending community lunches and skipped the weekly book club she had joined earlier in the year. When asked, she claimed she wanted to be home with Harold to make sure he was comfortable. While this explanation seemed reasonable, it also left Eleanor isolated, with no outlet for her worries. The long, quiet nights in their modest 2-bedroom unit became a breeding ground for her fears and for the thoughts she tried hard to suppress. The life insurance policy Harold had taken out in August lingered in Eleanor's mind. It was not a large policy by national standards, just enough to cover debts, funeral costs, and provide a modest cushion for her remaining years. Harold had signed it willingly, believing it would protect her, never suspecting how the existence of that policy might alter the way Eleanor saw their situation. Each overdue bill, each collection notice, seemed to whisper the same cruel message. Without Harold's death, there would be no escape. At the same time, Eleanor convinced herself that her thoughts were not purely selfish. She told herself she was considering Harold's suffering, that he had spoken of not wanting to live through decline. She remembered the words he muttered late at night, asking for release. Was it wrong to take those words seriously? Was it love or betrayal to act on them? These questions churned in her mind, blurring the line between compassion and desperation. On the evening of November 12, 2022, Eleanor was seen walking Harold slowly back to their unit after a brief outing to sit by the community fountain. A neighbor recalled how Harold leaned heavily on her arm, his body frail but his eyes warm when he greeted passers-by. "Evening, folks," he said softly with a polite nod. It would be the last time most of them saw him alive. The following morning, Harold would be found lifeless in their bedroom, his face pressed into a pillow. Eleanor would call for help in a trembling voice, telling first responders that her husband had been struggling and she had simply tried to ease his passing. What began as a claim of mercy would quickly unravel into a far darker story, one that forced detectives, neighbors, and even their own children to ask, was this truly an act of love, or was it a carefully hidden crime? The morning of November 13, 2022, began like any other in Desert Palms Senior Living Village. The sun rose over Mesa, casting a golden hue across the desert landscape. By 7 a.m., a few residents were already walking the paths for light exercise, while others gathered in the clubhouse for their usual morning coffee. In the Davis household, however, silence lingered longer than usual. Eleanor, who normally emerged around 7:30 to water her plants or wave at neighbors, did not appear. Instead, she remained inside, pacing the small living room, her face pale and her hands trembling. Inside the master bedroom, Harold Davis lay motionless on the bed. His body was positioned on his back, his head tilted slightly to one side, and a pillow rested loosely against his face. His chest no longer rose and fell, and the soft hum of labored breathing that neighbors often heard through the thin walls was absent. The room smelled faintly of medication and stale air, with a nightstand cluttered with pill bottles, tissues, and a half-empty glass of water. At 8:12 a.m., Eleanor picked up the phone and dialed 911. Her voice shook as she told the dispatcher that her husband had passed during the night. "He couldn't take it anymore," she said quietly, almost whispering into the receiver. Emergency medical technicians arrived at Unit 142 of Desert Palms within 10 minutes. What they found was not a typical scene of a man who had simply passed in his sleep. The pillow, the position of Harold's body, and faint markings around his neck immediately caught their attention. Eleanor explained her version of events in a wavering but composed tone. She claimed Harold had begged her for relief, that he was in constant agony, and that she had held the pillow over his face to help him rest. It was a shocking admission, one that left the first responders stunned. Some paramedics had encountered end-of-life situations before, but rarely had a spouse openly acknowledged playing a direct role in hastening death. Eleanor described it not as murder but as mercy. "He didn't want to suffer anymore," she repeated, her voice soft but steady. Protocol required that local police be called. By 8:45 a.m., officers from the Mesa Police Department arrived. They spoke with Eleanor in the living room while crime scene technicians began photographing the bedroom. Detectives quickly realized the complexity of what they were hearing. Eleanor was not denying involvement. She openly admitted to pressing the pillow against Harold's face. But her explanation, compassion, love, and mercy, raised difficult questions. Was this a case of euthanasia born out of desperation, or was there another motive hidden beneath her words? Neighbors gathered quietly outside, whispering among themselves as the ambulance remained parked in front of the Davis unit. Many were in disbelief. Harold and Eleanor had always appeared devoted to one another. To imagine Eleanor involved in his death was almost unthinkable. Yet rumors spread quickly. Some residents speculated that Harold had asked her to end his life. Others believed Eleanor must have reached a breaking point from stress. In a close-knit retirement community, speculation ran rampant, and within hours the Davis story became the subject of hushed conversations over coffee and card games. At the hospital, Harold's body underwent preliminary examination. The medical examiner noted petechial hemorrhages, tiny red spots in the eyes and skin around the neck, that strongly suggested suffocation rather than natural death. This finding cast doubt on Eleanor's portrayal of the event as a gentle passing. Strangulation or smothering, even when intended as mercy, left physical evidence that could not be ignored. Detectives returned to Eleanor later that afternoon for a more formal interview. Sitting at the small dining table in her unit, Eleanor repeated her story. Harold had been suffering, he had asked her to help, and she could no longer watch him in pain. But her words began to shift subtly under questioning. At first, she claimed Harold explicitly asked her to smother him. Later, she admitted he had only spoken generally about not wanting to live in misery. When pressed further, she broke down, sobbing, and said, "I just couldn't handle it anymore." The inconsistency raised suspicion. If Harold had directly requested death, it would suggest an act of assisted suicide, though still illegal in Arizona. If not, then Eleanor's actions could be framed as a unilateral decision, crossing the line into murder. Detectives could not ignore another detail: Harold's recently signed life insurance policy. The policy, obtained only 3 months earlier, named Eleanor as the sole beneficiary. While the payout was modest, investigators saw it as a possible motive layered beneath the claim of mercy. By evening, news of Harold's death reached the couple's adult children. Their daughter, living in Colorado, expressed disbelief on the phone with detectives. She admitted her father had been ill, but she had never heard him ask for death. Their son, who lived in Texas, was more cautious, saying he knew his mother had been overwhelmed but could not imagine her smothering Harold deliberately. Both children expressed shock at the mention of a new life insurance policy, something neither of them knew about. The day ended with Eleanor transported to the police station for further questioning. She was not yet formally charged but was considered a person of interest. Detectives emphasized that Harold's death was suspicious and that her admission of smothering him could not be dismissed. Eleanor, exhausted and trembling, signed a written statement describing the act as an attempt to end suffering. It was a confession, but one wrapped in ambiguity. That night, November 13th, Desert Palms was unusually quiet. The news spread through the community, leaving many unsettled. For decades, Harold and Eleanor had been seen as a couple bound by loyalty and faith. Now their story had shifted into something darker, something that forced everyone to confront uncomfortable questions. Was Eleanor a devoted wife who granted her husband's unspoken wish, or was she a desperate woman who chose financial relief over love? The inciting incident had taken place. What might have been viewed as a natural death had transformed into a potential homicide investigation, and Eleanor Davis, once admired as a devoted caregiver, now stood at the center of suspicion. The hours and days following Harold Davis's death marked the beginning of a careful, methodical investigation by the Mesa Police Department. Though Eleanor had admitted to placing the pillow over her husband's face, detectives understood that cases involving elderly spouses and end-of-life suffering were never straightforward. They had to balance compassion with procedure, ensuring that every detail was documented, every motive examined, and every fact separated from speculation. On November 14, 2022, detectives returned to Desert Palms to continue their work inside the Davis residence. Crime scene technicians combed through the small 2-bedroom unit with precision. They photographed the bedroom from every angle, collected the pillow Eleanor claimed to have used, and gathered Harold's medical records, pill bottles, and recent mail. Among the papers stacked neatly on the dining table, investigators found insurance documents dated August 3, 2022, the life insurance policy Harold had signed just months before his death. The discovery was flagged immediately, not because the policy itself was illegal or unusual, but because the timing aligned too closely with his sudden demise. The medical examiner's autopsy, conducted on November 15, provided critical insight. Harold's body bore signs consistent with smothering: petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, faint bruising along the neck, and congestion in the lungs. The examiner ruled the death as homicide by asphyxiation, noting that while Harold's pre-existing conditions were severe, they did not directly cause his death. This ruling shifted the case from a question of mercy to a clear matter of criminal law. Eleanor's confession could no longer be seen as a vague statement of compassion. It now placed her squarely at the center of a homicide investigation. Detectives next focused on Eleanor's financial situation. With a subpoena, they gained access to her bank and credit card records. The findings were troubling. Eleanor was more than $40,000 in debt, spread across multiple credit cards with high interest rates. Collection agencies had begun sending warnings, and late fees accumulated month after month. Investigators also learned that the couple's retirement savings had been nearly depleted due to Harold's medical costs. Their income from pensions and Social Security barely covered rent, utilities, and basic living expenses. Detectives began to suspect that the new life insurance policy, valued at $150,000, may have been seen by Eleanor not only as a safeguard but as the only solution to her mounting financial crisis. Meanwhile, interviews with neighbors painted a mixed picture. Some described Eleanor as a loving, attentive wife who rarely left Harold's side. Others noted her increasing fatigue and visible stress, particularly in the weeks before Harold's death. A few recalled overhearing Harold express a wish not to linger in pain, though none reported hearing him explicitly ask Eleanor to end his life. One neighbor described seeing Eleanor crying alone in her car just a week earlier, her hands gripping the steering wheel as though she were carrying a crushing weight. To detectives, these accounts suggested both devotion and desperation, a dangerous combination when coupled with financial ruin. Detectives also reached out to the Davis children. Their daughter insisted her father would never ask Eleanor to smother him, describing him as a man of faith who believed strongly in enduring hardships rather than choosing an early death. Their son, though more reserved, admitted he worried his mother might have been overwhelmed but still found it hard to believe she could intentionally take their father's life. Both children expressed shock at the revelation of Eleanor's debts. They had assumed their parents were financially stable and were stunned to learn how much pressure Eleanor had been under. On November 17th, Eleanor was asked to come to the police station for another round of questioning. Detectives approached her with empathy but also firmness. They presented the autopsy findings, highlighting that Harold had not died naturally. They asked about her financial troubles, the life insurance policy, and the inconsistencies in her story. At first, Eleanor clung to her claim of mercy, repeating that Harold didn't want to go on like this. When pressed about the debts, she broke down, admitting that the bills had been overwhelming, that she had felt trapped. "I loved him," she said through tears. "I didn't want him to suffer. But I didn't know what else to do." Detectives faced a difficult task, determining whether Eleanor's actions stemmed primarily from compassion or from financial desperation. In Arizona, euthanasia is illegal, but proving intent beyond mercy required evidence of motive. The insurance policy and debt records became critical pieces in building that narrative. The community of Desert Palms remained on edge. News of Harold's death spread beyond the retirement village, picked up by local media outlets that reported on the unusual case of a wife admitting to smothering her husband. Headlines raised questions about mercy killing, financial ruin, and the blurred line between love and crime. Residents debated fiercely. Some sympathized with Eleanor, believing she had simply carried out Harold's unspoken wishes, while others viewed her as a woman who let desperation drive her to murder. By November 20th, the investigation had gathered enough evidence for prosecutors to review. Eleanor was officially arrested on suspicion of second-degree murder, though charges had not yet been finalized. Detectives continued to build their case, balancing Eleanor's confession with the circumstantial but powerful evidence of financial motive. The initial investigation had revealed a stark truth. Harold Davis had not simply passed away in his sleep, nor had his death been the result of natural decline. It had been an intentional act, carried out by the woman he had loved for over 50 years. Whether born from love, despair, or a blend of both, the decision left investigators and the community struggling with one haunting question. Was Eleanor Davis a grieving wife who made a tragic mistake, or was she a calculating woman who saw her husband's death as her only way out? As the investigation moved into its second week, detectives believed they had a fairly clear picture. Eleanor Davis had smothered her husband, possibly under the guise of mercy, but with an undeniable financial motive tied to debt and the recently signed life insurance policy. Yet just when the case seemed straightforward, new evidence began to surface. Evidence that complicated the narrative and cast fresh doubt on Eleanor's version of events. On November 22, 2022, detectives received results from the forensic analysis of Harold's medical records and medications. Among the dozens of pill bottles collected from the Davis home, two stood out. One was a prescription for oxycodone, a powerful opioid painkiller, and the other was a sedative prescribed to help Harold sleep. Toxicology results revealed that Harold had ingested an unusually high amount of both drugs in the hours before his death. The levels were far above the dosages recommended by his doctors, enough to significantly impair his breathing and consciousness. In other words, Harold had been heavily sedated or even incapacitated before the pillow was pressed to his face. This revelation raised new questions. Did Harold take the extra pills himself, attempting to end his life quietly? Or had Eleanor administered them, ensuring he would be too weak to resist when she smothered him? Either scenario changed the case dramatically. If Harold had self-medicated, it suggested he may have been seeking release on his own terms, adding weight to Eleanor's claim that he wanted his suffering to end. But if Eleanor had given him the pills deliberately, it pointed toward premeditation, strengthening the prosecution's case that this was not mercy but murder. Detectives confronted Eleanor with the toxicology findings. At first, she insisted Harold must have taken the pills himself. He kept them by his bedside, she explained. I couldn't watch him every second. But her statement conflicted with earlier accounts from neighbors and her own children, who described Harold as cautious with his medication. Eleanor eventually admitted she may have helped him take a little more than usual because he was in pain that night, but she denied trying to drug him deliberately. Detectives noted her shifting explanations, a pattern that made her credibility increasingly fragile. The twist deepened when financial investigators discovered that Eleanor had made a phone call to her credit card company just 2 days before Harold's death, inquiring about settlement options for her outstanding balance. The customer service log revealed she mentioned expecting financial relief soon, a vague but telling phrase. Prosecutors later argued this statement hinted she was anticipating Harold's death and the insurance payout, not simply speaking about any ordinary source of income. Even more unsettling was the discovery of a handwritten note in Eleanor's nightstand. The note, dated November 10, 2022, contained fragmented sentences. Harold doesn't want to keep suffering. I can't pay these bills forever. Maybe it's time to end this for both of us. While not a formal confession, the note revealed Eleanor's mental state just 3 days before Harold's death. It painted a picture of a woman torn between love and despair, someone who may have rationalized an irreversible act as both compassionate and necessary. When prosecutors reviewed the evidence, they recognized the complexity of the case. The toxicology report suggested Harold was not fully conscious when smothered, the financial records showed Eleanor was drowning in debt, and the handwritten note hinted at intent. Yet there was still no clear proof of whether Harold had explicitly asked for death or whether Eleanor acted entirely on her own. The case teetered on the edge of two competing narratives, a tragic mercy killing or a calculated crime driven by financial desperation. The twist reached the public through media coverage. Local newspapers and television stations highlighted the shocking details, sparking intense debate among viewers and readers. Some saw Eleanor as a villain who drugged and suffocated her husband for money. Others viewed her as a broken woman who had lost her way under unbearable pressure. Editorials raised difficult questions about euthanasia laws, spousal caregiving, and the financial vulnerabilities of America's elderly population. Inside Desert Palms, the retirement community where the tragedy began, the mood shifted from quiet sympathy to unease. Residents who once defended Eleanor now questioned her motives. Some avoided her entirely, while others whispered about the pills, the debts, and the note. A few elderly couples even updated their own legal documents, shaken by the idea that a spouse could one day face the same moral crossroads. The Davis case had become not just a police matter but a mirror reflecting fears about aging, dependence, and mortality. By the end of November, detectives prepared their report for the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Their findings painted Eleanor as a woman in crisis who had both opportunity and motive. The evidence of excessive medication, the suspicious financial statements, and the handwritten note all pointed to intent. Still, the defense would argue that Harold's suffering, his vague statements about not wanting to live this way, and Eleanor's long-standing devotion to him complicated any claim of cold-blooded murder. The twist had changed everything. What began as a simple admission of mercy killing was now a case laced with ambiguity, where compassion and calculation overlapped in dangerous ways. Eleanor's fate would depend not only on the evidence but on how a jury interpreted her actions. Was she a desperate wife answering her husband's unspoken plea, or a financially cornered woman who chose death as her solution? By early December 2022, the case of Eleanor Davis had moved beyond the quiet streets of Desert Palms and into the legal system of Maricopa County, Arizona. After weeks of investigation, prosecutors decided there was enough evidence to formally charge her with second-degree murder. The charge carried the possibility of decades in prison, a fate that stunned many who had known her as nothing more than a devoted wife and grandmother. On December 5, 2022, Eleanor appeared in court for the first time, wearing a pale blue sweater and gray slacks instead of the typical jail uniform, as her attorneys had successfully argued for her temporary release on bond. Frail and visibly shaken, she stood before the judge as the charges were read aloud. Reporters filled the gallery, their pens moving quickly across notepads as cameras flashed. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. This was not just another criminal case but one layered with moral questions that divided public opinion. The prosecution framed Eleanor as a woman who had crossed a line, turning from caregiver to killer. They emphasized the autopsy findings, which confirmed Harold died from suffocation, not natural causes. They highlighted the toxicology report, showing Harold was heavily drugged before his death, and suggested Eleanor administered the overdose to ensure he could not resist. They also pointed to her crushing debts, the newly signed life insurance policy, and the handwritten note found in her nightstand. To the prosecution, these were not the signs of a loving wife but of a desperate woman who saw death as her only escape. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They described Eleanor as a 74-year-old woman who had cared for her ailing husband tirelessly, sacrificing her own health and peace of mind. They argued that Harold himself had often expressed a desire not to continue living in such misery and that Eleanor's actions, while tragic, were born of love and compassion, not greed. The defense acknowledged her financial troubles but framed them as irrelevant to her decision, insisting the debts had been building for years and did not suddenly push her to act. This was not about money, her attorney declared in court. This was about mercy. As the trial date approached, the case attracted growing media coverage. National outlets picked up the story, framing it as a debate about euthanasia in America. Editorials questioned whether the legal system was equipped to handle cases that straddled the line between compassion and crime. Television talk shows invited medical ethicists, legal experts, and religious leaders to weigh in. Some argued that Eleanor's actions were murder, plain and simple. Others said she should not be punished for granting her husband peace. Inside Desert Palms, residents followed every development closely. Many felt conflicted. They had seen Harold's suffering and Eleanor's exhaustion firsthand. To them, it was not impossible to believe she had acted out of love. Yet the revelations about her debts and the insurance policy made others wary. A retired nurse in the community remarked, "It's one thing to help someone who asks for it. It's another thing when money is involved." Conversations at the clubhouse grew tense, as even friends of Eleanor began to argue about what really drove her actions. In late December, the prosecution introduced a critical piece of evidence: the phone log showing Eleanor's call to her credit card company just days before Harold's death. They argued this demonstrated foresight, a clear sign she was expecting the life insurance payout soon. To the jury, this could look like planning. The defense countered that the statement was vague and could have referred to anything, even Harold's expected Social Security deposit. Still, the damage was done. The jury now had reason to doubt Eleanor's insistence that money played no role. Tension escalated further when the children of Harold and Eleanor were called to testify. Their daughter spoke tearfully about her father's faith, saying he would never have wanted to die this way. Their son, visibly conflicted, admitted he believed his mother loved Harold deeply but also confessed he worried she had been overwhelmed by financial and emotional stress. The children's divided testimony mirrored the larger conflict of the case: love versus motive, mercy versus murder. By January 2023, the trial had become a spectacle. Journalists filled the courtroom each day, and cable news channels broadcast nightly segments about the pillow case in Arizona, as some dubbed it. Jurors listened as medical experts testified about the nature of suffocation, the signs of overdose, and the psychological toll of caregiving. One doctor explained that Harold's level of sedation suggested he could not have taken the pills intentionally, supporting the prosecution's claim of premeditation. Another expert, called by the defense, insisted it was possible Harold consumed the medication himself in despair, making Eleanor's role more ambiguous. Through it all, Eleanor sat quietly, often staring at her folded hands. At moments, she appeared resolute, as if she believed her actions were justified. At others, she seemed broken, her shoulders slumped, tears glistening in her eyes as she listened to the description of Harold's final moments. Her silence left jurors to interpret her motives without the clarity of her own voice. The conflict reached its peak during closing arguments. The prosecution declared Eleanor's act was not mercy but murder, carried out with calculation under the weight of financial desperation. "This was not love," the prosecutor said. "This was a decision to end a life for money and convenience." The defense countered with equal passion, describing Eleanor as a devoted wife who made a tragic mistake under unbearable circumstances. "If love can ever be called a crime," her attorney told the jury, "then Eleanor Davis is guilty. But if you believe she acted out of compassion, then you must see this not as murder but as mercy." The courtroom was silent as the jury left to deliberate. The weight of Eleanor's future, and the meaning of Harold's death, now rested in their hands. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 full days inside the Maricopa County Courthouse. 12 men and women sifted through weeks of testimony, forensic evidence, and emotional appeals. Some jurors were moved by Eleanor's devotion to Harold, believing she may have acted out of love. Others were persuaded by the prosecution's arguments about financial motive and the toxicology report. The room was divided, and the weight of deciding whether an elderly woman was a murderer or a desperate caregiver pressed heavily on them all. On January 19, 2023, the jury returned to the courtroom. Eleanor sat between her attorneys, clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. Her children were present, seated in the front row, her daughter's face tense, her son's expression unreadable. The judge asked the foreperson to rise and deliver the verdict. The words that followed echoed through the hushed room: guilty of manslaughter in the second degree. It was not the murder conviction prosecutors had pushed for, but it was still a serious crime. The jury had concluded that Eleanor had indeed caused Harold's death, but that her actions were driven by emotional disturbance and desperation rather than premeditated intent to kill for profit. The judge scheduled sentencing for February, leaving Eleanor to return home under strict monitoring until the hearing. When sentencing arrived on February 23, 2023, Eleanor stood once more before the court. The prosecution asked for a lengthy prison term, arguing that a message had to be sent that mercy could not be used as a mask for murder. The defense pleaded for leniency, stressing Eleanor's age, her lack of criminal history, and the unique circumstances of the case. Eleanor herself spoke briefly, her voice frail but steady. "I loved Harold more than anything. I made a mistake I will regret until my last breath. I only wanted him to be at peace." The judge weighed both sides carefully before handing down the sentence: 7 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 4. The courtroom reacted with a mix of relief and sorrow. It was less than the decades prosecutors had sought, but more than the defense had hoped for. For Eleanor, it meant spending much of her remaining life behind bars. For her children, it meant losing both parents, one to death, the other to prison, in the span of a few short months. The story of Harold and Eleanor Davis faded from national headlines within weeks, but inside Desert Palms, it lingered as a cautionary tale. Residents still spoke of it in hushed tones, debating whether justice had truly been served. Some insisted Eleanor deserved punishment, pointing to the evidence of premeditation. Others argued she had already been punished enough, forced to live with the unbearable memory of ending her husband's life. Beyond the community, the case sparked broader discussions about elder care, euthanasia laws, and financial pressures faced by retirees. Advocacy groups used the Davis tragedy to call for reforms, arguing that families should not be left alone to navigate such impossible choices. Lawmakers debated but took no immediate action. The legal system had resolved Eleanor's case, but the moral questions it raised remained unsettled. In the end, Harold's death was remembered not only as the loss of a man who had lived a quiet, faithful life, but also as the center of a story that forced people to confront the fragile boundary between love and crime. Eleanor, once seen as a devoted wife, would forever be remembered for the night she chose to smother the man she had vowed to care for, in sickness and in health. Whether that act was mercy or murder would remain a question without a clear answer, one that only Eleanor herself could truly know.